Hi there, folks. Eric from Hit Subscribe here, and this week I am trying to maintain good posture. I don't know if this is working. The view I have of myself is a little strange, but I'm trying to like sit up so that I project instead of being hunched over in this very comfortable chair. So hopefully that's going well. I am doing yet another edition of the Freelancer Q&A series that I do. I did have a question this week in the community about I think it was this week, key man insurance. I opted not to ask that because the short answer is if you're a freelancer, that's probably not a thing you should do. But if you feel shortchanged by that, if any of you watching either on YouTube or wherever this gets distributed are like interested in a video about key man insurance, or I guess key person insurance probably these days, I'm not being like misogynist there. I think that has a long history of being called key man insurance. That's like what my insurance agent calls it. Anyway, if you want to know about that, let me know and I can do that. But I think that's going to be a relatively obscure topic for most freelancers because it's not a coverage that freelancers probably ought to do. So instead, I went to the backlog that I have of questions and I found this one. How do you address a client expecting consultative work as a throw-in? So I think I've talked in weeks past about kind of like whether you should opt to do extra consultative work or something as an upsell. Actually, yeah, I did a video about that. This is a little bit different. The way this was explained, I actually made a point this week. I did my homework a little bit and re-grokked the context. This was a 2 or 3 year old question. But this was specifically about software development and software architecture. So the person in this context was saying, how do I convince a client to pay more for the architecture? Like I'm not just banging out code. I'm also bringing my, acute, keen architectural mind to bear on this problem. And so the concern here seemed to be the client is uninterested in paying for, the experience that you bring to bear or that the person asking brings to bear in terms of the architecture. Just write the code. So how do you get away from that kind of thing? And how do you sell these consultative services for perhaps more money as an add-on to doing the programming labor? So that's what I'm going to dive in here today and answer. It's a little bit nuanced. So the first thing I'm going to start out by doing, and I hate to do this, but it's kind of by, gently pushing back here and saying, I don't really think architecture work is consultative. I think that if anything, it's just a more skilled or more experienced flavor of labor. So like, to get down to brass tacks here, like I'm just going to put this in sort of simple terms. If you're separating programming from architecture, let's call it, you're kind of doing a siloed division of labor that you might see inside of an organization where you've got the experienced people, the architects that are deciding, should we use the MVC pattern or this framework or what have you, and then maybe less experienced people who, once those types of design decisions are made, they're just kind of creating code within those decisions. So I can certainly those two types of people I just mentioned, person with a title like architect and a person with a title like junior programmer 2 are going to be paid differently within the organization. So I'm not disputing the idea that there is a different level of experience being brought to bear for, designing software in a good fashion for the long haul versus just banging out some forms over data. No question about that. But I don't think that the architecture piece is really labor or consulting. It's just maybe a precursor, depending on how you do things, to another form of labor that you're going to do. So I would think about this, if you're not convinced, think about this from the client's perspective and imagine that you were sort of like separating these items on an invoice. You were saying, okay, here's my invoice. I want $200 per hour for architecture and $100 per hour for the programming, even though I'm the same person doing both of them. And the architecture piece is where I'm doing the more valuable, higher skill type work that's really important to you. And then the labor piece is where I'm just kind of like turning off my brain a little bit and like executing the stuff that smarter me told dumber me to execute. Like it starts to break down. That becomes like a very weird thing to do, like all in one person. So like, I can't think of any way to pitch this idea to the client that doesn't get frankly bonkers, where you're saying like, oh, well, in the beginning, I'm going to be doing work that's twice as valuable. So the client might come back to you then and say like, well, okay, I guess, but like, why wouldn't you be billing at that $200 rate all the time? Like, no, I'm just paying you the $100 an hour. Like, I just can't imagine that conversation not being completely weird. So if you ever go and do work for like app dev organizations or larger like services firms that deploy like a number of different staff augmentations, usually you'll see this referred to as a blended rate. So they assign, you know, an architect to the account, and then they assign some programmers, and the architect's like $200 an hour, the programmers are $100 an hour, and they say we're going to have a blended rate of like 130 an hour for this project, and then you get a little bit of the architect and several of the devs. So this is a thing that's done, but nothing about that is consultative whatsoever. It's all just various flavors of labor blended together on an invoice. So if you really want to think about this from the highest level perspective, like most philosophically, consulting is a situation where somebody gives you money and then you tell them what to do. That's consulting. It's advice. What we're talking about here with architecture is, in the case of the blended rate for this hypothetical staff aug firm, it's you give the client money and then the architect at the client tells other people what to do. So that isn't consulting, even though the firm will probably call it that. It's just, it's labor. And then like they're kind of abstracting the client away from the details of who's giving the orders about what type of labor. But if this were just, you know, you again, the piece about architecture and the piece about programming where you're trying to upsell the architecture, you're not consulting. You're not telling the client what to do. You're kind of weirdly telling you what to do. And the client would then say, well, why would I pay you to tell you what to do? Why don't you just do it and not get like bananas on me here? So I don't want to belabor this point any further, but hopefully I'm making the case for this here. From the client's perspective, this is an odd experience. It's an odd thing that you're proposing. If I were them, I would just be thinking like, you know, what do I care which pieces you have to think harder for and all that? Just tell me like what you're going to charge me for the project and leave me out of these details. So if nothing else, you want to provide a better client experience, but also it's going to be hard to convince clients of things that are unusual, that maybe, let's say, violate the principle of least astonishment. And you going to the client and saying, well, I'm really doing two different flavors of labor here, so I want you to pay me a different hourly rate or whatever at different times, certainly violates the principle of least astonishment. So for the rest of this, let me use an example that I noted here. Of something that would actually be maybe like a blended kind of consulting and labor. And I'll pick something here that I think very few people that are doing app dev or doing like technician style of labor as a service would think to do, but it is the humble go, no go decision. So let's say that a client brings you in and says, I want to build some web application or some API or whatever for a certain purpose. Now, when you go in and you start listening to that client, you are going to engage in discovery, I imagine. So you're going to like ask them some questions, you know, what do you want this written in? Well, I wouldn't ask them that, but you're going to ask them some questions. Why are you writing this? What are you hoping to accomplish? What really needs to be true? So on and so forth. So this is very commonly called discovery. I would argue it is an absolutely crucial piece of any custom services type setup. The only time you might not be doing this is if you're like just doing straight up labor through Upwork or something. But anyway, almost nobody will charge for that. And I probably wouldn't either personally as a consultant. Like I just view discovery as part of the sales process. But if you're doing, you know, like large stints of app dev, so if a client wants you to spend 3-4 months building a website, you could think about, if you could sell them on this, saying, okay, what I'm going to do, like, because at some point, if there is so much discovery to be done, and this can quite often be true for custom application development projects, there might be so much discovery that you can't really reasonably do it all during your sales process. So you're not going to spend weeks and weeks having meetings with a sales prospect to try to like iron out every last detail and then get started. I would not recommend that. So often what will happen is the discovery starts to bleed into the execution. A less common way to do this is to structure an actual discovery engagement. Sometimes as they get more mature, like custom services firms will do exactly that. But it's more common for it to just kind of like happen as you get started and are charging them an hourly rate. But if you were to get a little bit more intentional about this, you could establish some criteria for, um, you know, doing discovery and say like, look, dear client, if there's anything more complicated than X, or if I anticipate that it's going to take more than 2 or 3 meetings to get all the particulars of your project, what I'm going to do is have our first engagement be a low risk, flat rate paid discovery session. So you give me $2,000. I'm going to walk you through a series of meetings. Here's the typical agenda and what this looks like. And if nothing else, you will come away from this with a lot of clarity as to whether or not you should even do this project. And if so, what kind of services you will need to do going into it. I've structured engagements like this in the past, and it's pretty easy to sell these, believe it or not. If you've never done it, that seems crazy, but it's actually pretty easy to sell these as long as the client gets the sense that at the other end of that, they'll be closer to a solution to their problem than they were. So go, no go is a big one. You know, if you've got somebody that calls you in, I'm just drawing on my own experience, calls you in and says, hey, I have this gnarly, like really old MS Access application. You know, can you tell me how to like get rid of this and blah, blah, blah. The first thing you might do is some kind of quick engagement to say like, all right, you know, let me spend a couple of days taking a look at this. I'm going to look through the code, interview a couple people. And by the end of this, I will tell you if you ought to contract with a services firm to essentially engineer like a screen by screen replacement, if you ought to move away from that and do something more basic, or if you ought to just leave the access thing in place for another year because reasons, you know, I don't know. So if they get the feeling that their world will be demystified somewhat by the end of this discovery engagement, they will often do that. So for the sake of the rest of this video and giving advice here, let's assume that you're doing something like that that is consultative, or you're at least contemplating it. So the most simple thing I can think of is a bit of advisory up front as to should you even do this project or not, or have you called me in with like this harebrained scheme that'll never work and you're about to set $500,000 on fire and be no better off for it. So my consulting is I come in and I do this initial like quick discovery and I say, yes, you're on the right track. Let's talk next steps, or no, don't do this. And here's why you shouldn't do this. And I just saved you a bunch of money. So now we're back into this world of the original question where let's say you are doing discovery of this nature and even occasionally saying, don't do this, this is a bad idea, but nobody's paying you for that. So I just talked about a success case where I've had luck in the past getting people to pay, but maybe you don't think or you don't have that confidence, and that's the situation that you're in. What do you do? So the first thing that I would think about is if you are existing in this world in some capacity, then probably this consulting you're doing, you tend to undervalue it and present it as some kind of formality. So if your consulting is really just something that's happening on the way to the real star of the show, which is labor, like the website build, and you kind of present it that way, then the client is going to interpret it that way. If what you're saying is like, you know, we're going to get started, but I will tell you if everything's a mess, I'm going to bail out, then you're kind of like a, you know, let's say a mechanic who is like, every time I go to work on a car, I do check to make sure that the car isn't totaled and that it wouldn't be a complete waste for me to do this. Now, in a sense, that's a form of consulting. The mechanic is saying, you know, I will advise you if need be that your car is a total. But for the most part, this is more of a quick, easy check that somebody would view as, I guess, just like professional ethics and competence, like table stakes for it. Like you shouldn't just do completely useless work to take somebody's money. So that's kind of the incumbent way that this is going to be looked at. So what you need to do is develop a compelling case that it isn't just that way. So it isn't just that you're going to come in and if the whole thing looks like a goat rope, you're going to tell them so, but it's more that like, you know, I go through this series of checks because there are some obvious things that suggest a project won't succeed, but there are some less obvious things that you're probably not thinking about. So if you can start to go through an agenda that you're going to take the client through, point to past successes, and position the consulting work that you're doing as really more of a polished professional type of thing, that's going to help a lot. It shouldn't just be a sort of like obvious lead into labor. It should be like, this is a real thing. And there is a real chance that I am not only going to tell you that I won't do this, I'm going to tell you that nobody should do this and you shouldn't do it at all. And that's a hard thing to hear. And I have experience telling people that. So bear in mind, that's on the table. So if you start to have that confidence and experience, it gets a lot easier. The other big thing here is that the work that you're doing, the consulting work, should be like a complete set of choose your own adventures. And what I mean is, if what you're doing is kind of doing a little bit of quick checking as a sanity check ahead of doing labor, now imagine a situation where you're coming in and you're like, whoa, this MS Access thing looks like a train wreck, and there's a lot of red flags here for me. Most likely what you do in that situation, if you encounter that during discovery, is you personally bail and you just say, yeah, I'm not touching that. This isn't a good project for me to buy. That's fine if you're doing diligence ahead of taking on a project. It's not fine if you're doing a proper engagement where you're making this decision. So if you're going into this and you're telling a client no go, you should be prepared to speak to what they should do next. That's part of being a good partner and giving good advice. So you should be prepared to say no go because these things aren't true, but here's a series of suggestions I have for making them true, and then let's go ahead. That's one thing. Or it could be no go, and here are a set of reasons that you shouldn't do this at all, and here's what you should do instead. Consider a commercial off-the-shelf solution, do a no-code solution, whatever the case may be, giving them advice about how to proceed. So no matter how this engagement ends, you should be leaving them with a deliverable in the form of advice that tells them what to do next. Those are the really big pieces of the actual engagement that I can think of. And then the other way to flip the bit here and to get paid for this consulting would be to, and I beat this to death, and sometimes I get flack for it in different communities or whatever, but stop doing labor. So I would suggest that when you're selling this type of consulting, you don't do the labor piece if you really want to establish yourself here. So if you really want to be the go, no go on whatever kind of application, let's, in this hypothetical I've strung together, I am the person that comes in and looks at this horrific like MS Office automation that companies have built, and I tell you whether or not to replace it or something. If that's your position, don't then go into the business of replacing it. That's all you do. You come in and you offer this consulting. You have a landing page on your site, or maybe your whole site's for it, and that is what you do. It will become a lot easier to sell this at a much more premium rate if companies aren't viewing this as the precursor to labor of some kind when they hire you. Now, if most of your book of business is coming through labor, I don't necessarily mean that you should just abandon all that, but maybe you have like 2 different brands or 2 different pages at least on your site, and you're either selling one or the other as you kind of transition to doing more and more consulting. So let me regroup a little here. I made some notes ahead of time. I was very prepared for this particular live stream for some reason. That I wanted to circle back to the original question, because the original question was really about selling architecture, which I was saying don't do that. It's not really like a particularly reason. At least it's not consulting. So I kind of swapped in this other example instead, but like, let's generalize to you are doing something uncompensated that is consulting, and then also the thing you are compensated for, which is labor. How do you remediate that situation, assuming your goal is to be compensated for the consulting? So the first thing that you want to do is confirm whether there is actual value to the thing for which you want to be compensated. And if you're trying to sell consulting services, whether that thing is consulting or not. So that's step one. I guess step 1B would be, if what you're doing isn't consulting, come up with some kind of thing you would do as part of the engagement or ahead of the engagement that would be consulting, and then follow the rest of this advice. So step 2, assuming you have arrived at something that is consulting and you're kind of doing this juggling of consulting and labor, and you want to move towards the higher ticket consulting, then make the consulting standalone. It shouldn't just be a throw in or like a Gantt chart milestone on the way to the actual labor delivery. So the client should be able to reason about and justify the consulting alone as a value add, no matter what you're telling them to do afterwards, no go or go, rewrite, don't rewrite, whatever. In either case, whatever your recommendations, they should have clear next steps where you're, telling them what to do next. And then finally, in terms of your own positioning, if you start to get some traction with the consulting, I would, at a bare minimum, create separate landing pages on your site for it. Think about creating entirely separate sites, and then also draw kind of a fence between your labor clients and your consulting clients. It is my experience, and I've also watched other people do this or try to do it. When you sell both labor and consulting, you sell labor. You will get pulled into labor. Everybody will view you as a labor vendor. It is very, very difficult to pull off being a consultant while laboring. I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying that the most common scenario with that is not success. So I wouldn't, start out swimming upstream with that. I would try to separate your consulting piece from your labor piece as much as possible and see how much traction you can get with the consulting piece. But again, that all assumes that you want to do consulting, which is my read on this question, admittedly 3 years old or whatever now, was that the desire was to get that higher rate and to do more consulting. So I have addressed everything through that lens. If you, watching this and you enjoy doing the labor piece, God bless, go for it. So anyway, I hope at least some of you out there found that helpful, and I will catch you all next time.